If you drink that, you won't wake up. The words didn't rise above the music, didn't cut through the laughter, didn't even reach the crystal chandeliers hanging like frozen waterfalls above the room, but they landed exactly where they needed to, right between Daniel Whitmore's heartbeat and the rim of his glass. His hand paused midair, a $2,000 Bordeaux reflecting the golden lights of a Manhattan rooftop where power dressed in tailored suits and spoke in quiet deals worth hundreds of millions, and for a fraction of a second time didn't stop. It narrowed, sharpened, focused. Around him the evening flowed on, waiters gliding across polished marble, a saxophone humming low and smooth, investors leaning in with half smiles and half truths. But Daniel didn't move because something in that voice, soft, controlled, certain, didn't belong to panic, it belonged to knowledge. He lowered the glass just an inch, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough to break the moment that had almost sealed his fate, and slowly, almost reluctantly, his eyes shifted, not toward the crowd, not toward the men waiting for his approval, but slightly to his left where she stood. Aaliyah Brooks didn't look like a disruption, she looked like part of the background. A young black waitress in a pressed uniform, posture straight, expression neutral, the kind of presence people like Daniel had trained themselves not to see, because seeing meant acknowledging, and acknowledging meant adjusting the illusion of control. She held a tray, balanced perfectly in one hand, her other hand resting lightly at her side. No trembling, no urgency, just stillness, the kind that suggested she had already calculated the risk of speaking and decided it was worth it. Daniel studied her for half a second longer than necessary, his instincts, honed in boardrooms and hostile takeovers, whispering that this wasn't random, that nothing about this night was random, not the sudden invitation from a rival firm, not the unusually crowded guest list, not the way certain conversations had gone quiet when he approached, and now not this. The glass in his hand suddenly felt heavier, not with wine but with possibility, and for the first time that evening Daniel Whitmore, a man who had built an empire by trusting only himself, hesitated. "What did you say?" he murmured, barely turning his head, his voice low enough to disappear into the music. But she didn't repeat herself immediately, instead she leaned in just enough for her words to reach only him, her tone unchanged, calm, precise, almost clinical. "I said don't drink that." And then she straightened, stepping back into the rhythm of service as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't just interrupted the trajectory of a man who believed he controlled every room he entered. Daniel looked down at the glass again, the surface now perfectly still, betraying nothing, offering no answers, just a reflection of a man who suddenly wasn't as certain as he had been 30 seconds ago. And in a room built on confidence, that uncertainty was the most dangerous thing of all. Daniel did not drink, not because he trusted her, but because something inside him refused to ignore certainty when it whispered instead of shouted, and that alone was enough to shift the balance of the night. He lowered the glass completely this time, setting it gently onto the white linen tablecloth as if it were suddenly fragile, as if any sudden movement might reveal something he was not ready to see, and across from him, the man who had just been mid-sentence about expansion into European markets paused for a fraction too long, a hesitation so small most would miss it. But Daniel Whitmore did not build a billion-dollar empire by missing details. He collected them, stored them, weaponized them, and right now, every instinct he had was telling him that something had just gone wrong beneath the surface of a perfectly curated evening. "Everything all right?" the man asked with a polite smile that did not quite reach his eyes, and Daniel returned the smile just as smoothly, nodding. Once slow, controlled, the kind of nod that said everything was fine while his mind was already 3 steps ahead. Already rewinding the last 10 minutes, replaying every movement around his table, every server who passed by, every hand that came too close to his drink. The music continued, the skyline shimmered beyond the glass walls, and conversations resumed like nothing had shifted, but Daniel's world had narrowed again, not to the room, not to the deal, but to a single question. Why would she say that? He glanced to his left, but Aaliyah was no longer standing where she had been. She had moved, seamlessly, invisibly, now refilling water at another table, her expression unchanged, her posture composed as if she had not just altered the course of his night with 6 quiet words, and that unsettled him more than anything else, because panic leaves traces, fear leaves cracks, but she had left nothing, just certainty. Daniel reached for his phone beneath the table, his thumb moving quickly, discreetly, sending a single message to his head of security station downstairs. A simple instruction without explanation, have someone check the drink. No alarm, no attention, just quiet verification, because if She was wrong, this was nothing, but if she was right, then everything about this room, this deal, this carefully arranged gathering of power players, had just shifted into something far more dangerous than negotiation. Seconds stretched, then folded back into the rhythm of the evening, but Daniel did not touch the glass again, not when the server offered to refresh it, not when a guest raised a toast, not even when the man across from him lifted his own drink and watched him just a little too closely, and then a vibration against his palm, subtle but immediate, his phone lighting up with a response that was shorter than he expected. Only 3 words, but heavy enough to drain the warmth from the room around him. Do not drink. And just like that, the golden lights, the laughter, the polished confidence of everyone in the room felt thinner, like a stage set instead of reality, and Daniel Whitmore, a man who had spent his life believing control was absolute, finally understood that control could disappear without warning. Sometimes with nothing more than a whisper. Daniel did not look up immediately because reacting too fast meant revealing too much, and in rooms like this information was currency, and control was maintained by those who knew when to stay still. Instead, he let the conversation continue for another beat, nodding at the right moments, offering a measured response about market positioning, even allowing a quiet chuckle to escape as if nothing had shifted beneath his feet. But inside, everything had already recalibrated because 3 words from his security team had confirmed what instinct had already warned him, and now the question was no longer if something was wrong, but who in this room had orchestrated it and how close he was to the center of it. His eyes moved again, not directly, never directly, but through reflections through the mirrored surface of a polished wine bucket, through the glass panels framing the skyline, catching fragments of movement without drawing attention, and that was when he saw it, not the act itself but the pattern, a man near the far end of the table, someone introduced earlier as part of a partner firm, shifting slightly, his attention not on the discussion but on Daniel, watching in that careful, controlled way that tried too hard to look casual. Daniel leaned back in his chair, slow, deliberate, creating space between himself and the table, and more importantly, between himself and the untouched glass that now felt like a silent witness, and then, as if guided by something deeper than strategy, his focus returned to her. Aaliyah was moving again, this time closer, her path weaving naturally between tables, her tray now carrying fresh glasses, untouched, pristine, and for a moment their eyes met, not long, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for recognition to pass between them, not familiarity, not trust but awareness, the kind that exists when 2 people understand something the rest of the room does not. Daniel stood up then, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to signal a brief pause, smoothing his jacket as he offered a polite excuse about taking a call, the kind no one questions when it comes from a man like him, and as he stepped away from the table, the music seemed louder, the lights harsher, the room no longer a place of negotiation but a stage where something unseen was unfolding. He moved toward the edge of the rooftop, where the city stretched out in miles of glowing grids and moving headlights, and only then did he allow his composure to shift, just slightly, his jaw tightening, his mind assembling pieces faster now, the invitation, the guest list, the subtle tension he had dismissed earlier as competition, all of it aligning into something far more deliberate. Footsteps approached, soft but intentional, and he did not need to turn to know it was her because she did not hesitate, did not slow, she simply stopped at a respectful distance beside him, still within the role she was expected to play, and yet completely outside of it at the same time. You should leave soon, she said quietly, her voice steady, not urgent, not afraid, just certain, and Daniel finally turned to face her. Fully, studying her not as background, not as staff, but as the only person in the room who had spoken the truth without hesitation. And for the first time that night, the most powerful man in the room was not the one holding the deal, but the one who had seen the danger before anyone else even knew it existed. Daniel did not respond right away, not because he did not understand her, but because the simplicity of her words carried a weight that no negotiation ever had, and for a man who had spent his life calculating outcomes, predicting moves and controlling environments, this was different. This was uncertainty wrapped in quiet certainty, and it unsettled him in a way no competitor ever had. He turned his body slightly toward her, just enough to signal that this was no longer a passing interaction. His eyes narrowing not with suspicion alone, but with curiosity, because people did not interrupt men like him without reason, and they certainly did not do it twice in the same night without something deeper behind it. Why? He asked, His voice low, controlled, the same tone he used in boardrooms when a deal began to shift in ways others had not yet noticed. But Aaliyah did not answer immediately. Instead she glanced past him, toward the glass doors leading back into the dining area, where the room continued to glow with wealth and illusion, and when she spoke again, her words were measured, precise, as if she had already decided how much truth he was ready to hear. "Because whatever is happening in there was not meant to stop with a drink," she said softly, and that sentence did not create panic, it created clarity, the kind that rearranges priorities in an instant. Daniel followed her gaze back into the room, and now that he was looking differently, he saw it, not one thing, but a series of small inconsistencies that no longer felt accidental, conversations that paused too quickly when certain people moved, a server who avoided a specific section of the table, a guest whose attention never quite aligned with the discussion, all of it forming a pattern that had been invisible until someone had pointed him in the right direction. His phone vibrated again, another message from security, longer this time, confirming contamination, advising discretion, and suddenly the rooftop did not feel like a celebration, it felt like a controlled environment designed for something far more calculated. Daniel exhaled slowly, his posture still composed, but his mind now operating on a different level, not as a participant in the evening, but as someone navigating a situation that had already escalated beyond business. And when he looked back at Aaliyah, truly looked at her, he saw something he had overlooked before, not just composure but awareness, the kind that comes from experience, from having learned to read rooms not for opportunity but for risk. "You knew before I did," he said quietly, not as an accusation but as an observation, and she met his gaze without hesitation, her expression unchanged. "I noticed things you were not supposed to notice," she replied, and there was no pride in her voice, no attempt to impress, just a statement of fact. For a moment the distance between them, measured in feet and status and everything society had placed between a billionaire and a waitress, seemed irrelevant because in that moment, knowledge was the only currency that mattered, and she had more of it than anyone else in the room. Daniel glanced once more toward the table he had left behind, where his glass still sat untouched, a silent piece of evidence in a game he had not agreed to play, and then back to her, his voice quieter now, more deliberate. "If I walk out right now, what happens?" And Aaliyah did not hesitate, because she had already thought that far ahead. "Then whoever set this up will know you saw it," she said, her tone steady, "and they will adjust." And that was when Daniel understood that leaving was not an exit, it was a move, and for the first time that night, he was no longer reacting, he was deciding not just whether to stay, but how to turn a moment of vulnerability into something else entirely, something that would reveal not just the threat, but the person behind it. Daniel exhaled slowly, the city lights beyond the glass walls stretching like a river of fire and movement, and he realized that for the first time that evening, the rhythm of the party did not dictate his pulse, the music did not set the pace of his thoughts, and the laughter of the wealthy gathered around him no longer carried the same authority it had moments ago. Aaliyah stood beside him, her posture composed, her eyes scanning the edge of the room as if calculating probabilities invisible to everyone else, her calm contrasting sharply with the tension that now hummed through Daniel's body, and he could feel the weight of her certainty pressing against the walls of his assumptions, challenging the notion that control was his alone, that observation was only his tool, and that consequence followed only his design. He glanced at the guests still seated, noticing subtleties he had ignored before, the slight hesitation in the handshake of a partner, the micro-expression of a manager who had just realized an irregularity in the catering order, the faint glance between two investors whose conversation had abruptly stopped when his own focus had drifted, all of it forming a mosaic that he had not been permitted to notice until now. And it struck him that the evening, meticulously planned to convey power and dominance, had quietly begun to unravel under the watch of someone considered invisible, someone whose presence had been dismissed, someone whose insight had been underestimated. Daniel shifted his weight, feeling the tension in his legs, and recognized that the room, for all its glittering opulence, had become a field of subtle threats and hidden truths, and only one person had the clarity to navigate it with the foresight he did not possess. And that person was Aaliyah. She leaned slightly closer, her voice low, almost blending with the ambient hum of the music, yet sharp enough to pierce through the layers of decorum and pretense. "The situation is more complex than you think," she said, and Daniel nodded slowly, realizing that every decision from this point forward would depend not on his instincts alone, but on the observations of someone who saw without being seen, and who acted without performing, and the awareness of that fact made his hands tighten briefly on the edge of the railing. Grounding himself in the reality that the evening had transformed from a display of success into a test of discernment, judgment, and the subtle ethics of human action. The cityscape below was alive, yet silent compared to the tension between them, and Daniel could feel the pulse of calculation shifting. The game had changed, and it was no longer about who controlled the room, but about who had seen the hidden currents first, and that realization was as unnerving as it was necessary, because for the first time, he understood that the smallest action, a single whisper, a single glance, could redirect the course of events in ways that no power, no wealth, and no authority could anticipate, and in that recognition, the billionaire CEO experienced a rare moment of humility, acknowledging silently that authority was not absolute, foresight was never perfect, and the quiet intervention of one underestimated individual could alter outcomes previously thought secure, and as he absorbed that understanding, he also recognized the responsibility it conferred, that inaction could have consequences far greater than any calculated risk, and he looked at Aaliyah with a mixture of respect, curiosity, and attentive trust, the kind that forms when someone demonstrates not force, not intimidation, but insight, awareness, and moral clarity that cuts through the noise, the gilded distractions, and the carefully curated spectacle, leaving only the essential truth of the moment between them. The rooftop felt smaller now, the wind carrying the faint scent of the city below, mingling with the rich aroma of aged wood and polished metals from the lounge behind them, and Daniel Whitmore, for the first time in years, allowed himself to simply observe, letting the moment stretch without forcing a response, without scripting a reaction, because he realized that some things could not be negotiated, only acknowledged. Aaliyah Brooks remained a constant presence beside him, silent in posture, but commanding through the quiet of her focus, her eyes scanning the perimeter, noting details that might escape the most trained observers, subtle shifts in expressions, tiny gestures, the soft click of heels against marble, all converging into a map of human behavior and intention that she alone could read, and Daniel felt a mixture of admiration and unease at the precision of her awareness, recognizing that her expertise was not granted by title or authority but earned through experience and attention to the unspoken. He moved a step closer to her, careful to maintain distance that preserved their professional boundaries, yet close enough to feel the gravity of her insight, and in that space, he considered the implications of the evening, the carefully orchestrated gathering that had been designed to impress, to assert dominance, to secure alliances, and now, with one quiet intervention, it had shifted into a landscape of uncertainty, accountability, and the subtle reordering of priorities. The hum of conversations from the lounge below filtered through the glass walls, punctuated by soft laughter and the occasional clink of a glass, but it felt distant, irrelevant to the core of the situation that now commanded his attention, because this was no longer about appearances or the optics of influence, it was about comprehension, about understanding who had seen, who had acted, and who had remained passive, and Daniel realized that inaction in the face of foresight carried consequences, sometimes invisible until observed by those willing to engage with the truth. He watched Aaliyah adjust a tray, small movements executed with precision and care, not for display but for effectiveness, and he noted the contrast between the casual movements of other servers and her deliberate, purposeful gestures, understanding that her presence altered the dynamics of the room, the assumptions of the powerful, and even the rhythm of the unfolding evening, and that awareness settled over him like a quiet revelation, humbling in its subtlety yet formidable in impact. He exhaled, slow, measured, and for a moment allowed himself to acknowledge that the lessons of the evening were not taught in boardrooms or contracts, but in the choices of those often overlooked, whose diligence, insight, and moral clarity could intervene at the critical point and redirect outcomes in ways that neither wealth nor status could anticipate or control. Daniel's gaze shifted once more to the city. Lights stretching into the horizon, each street and building a reminder of systems, structures, and hierarchies, and yet all of that seemed secondary, almost irrelevant, compared to the immediate reality beside him, the awareness that true influence sometimes resided in unexpected quarters, that observation and action guided by insight could outweigh power and authority, and in that recognition, he felt the rare combination of respect and unease, the acknowledgement that the evening had perspective offered by someone who had seen, understood, and intervened with quiet precision. Daniel Whitmore finally allowed himself a slow, deliberate exhale, the tension of the evening dissolving into a heightened awareness rather than relief, and he realized that for the first time he was seeing beyond the polished surfaces, beyond the carefully orchestrated presentations, and into the subtle undercurrents that had guided the room unnoticed until now. Aaliyah Brooks stood beside him, poised yet unobtrusive, her presence a quiet anchor amid the soft glow of chandeliers and the faint hum of conversation still lingering in the lounge behind them, and Daniel noted that her awareness extended far beyond mere observation, that she had not only seen the signs but had anticipated the unfolding consequences, and in that recognition, he understood that the distinction between perception and action was the difference between vulnerability and safety, between mere power and true influence. He watched as she adjusted the placement of a glass on a nearby table, a small motion executed with precision and care, a gesture that held no audience yet conveyed command, and he realized that the lessons of this night were not in what had been said but in what had been done quietly, deliberately, and without need for acknowledgement. The city stretched below, a labyrinth of lights and motion, yet the magnitude of that panorama felt secondary to the insight beside him, to the clarity that came from observing, assessing, and acting with purpose, and Daniel felt a rare humility settle over him, tempered with curiosity, as he considered the implications of the quiet authority she had demonstrated, the effectiveness of intellect, awareness, and ethical decisiveness in a situation where power alone would have been insufficient. He leaned slightly toward her, careful to respect the boundary that still existed between them, and said, his voice low and measured, "I underestimated the room, and I underestimated you." And she responded not with affirmation or acknowledgement, merely a calm nod that carried far more weight than words, a signal that her role had never been about recognition, but about seeing, understanding, and acting in ways that mattered most. Daniel reflected on the chain of events that had brought them to this point, the subtleties of human behavior, the unspoken cues, the almost imperceptible hesitations, and he recognized that in a world defined by control, leverage, and perception, true competence was demonstrated not by dominance but by insight and timely intervention, and in that understanding, he allowed himself a rare openness, considering not the optics of the evening, but the substance, the ethical clarity, and the quiet decisiveness that had prevailed, and he realized that the lesson extended beyond the immediate, beyond the room, beyond the night, into a broader understanding of human capacity, responsibility, and respect. The wind from the rooftop carried a soft chill, brushing past them, and Daniel took it as a moment to process, to acknowledge, and to internalize the subtle transformation that had occurred, not through confrontation or spectacle, but through attentiveness, wisdom, and integrity. He glanced at her one final time, seeing the composure, the quiet authority, and the moral clarity that had guided her actions, and he understood that the balance of the evening, the flow of influence, and the outcome of circumstances had shifted irrevocably, guided by someone who had been overlooked, underestimated, and underestimated again. And in that awareness, Daniel Whitmore felt the profound truth that power, when untempered by insight and ethics, was fragile, and that human action, when precise, thoughtful, and ethically grounded, had the capacity to redefine outcomes, redirect events, and illuminate the unseen, leaving him not only impressed but fundamentally changed in his perception of what it meant to truly influence, protect, and understand the room, the moment, and the people within it. Daniel Whitmore stepped back slightly from the edge of the rooftop, his eyes sweeping the city below as if measuring every light, every shadow, every movement for meaning, and in that quiet space between the ambient hum of traffic and the distant murmurs from the lounge behind him, he realized that the evening had transformed from a display of status into a lesson in attentiveness and consequence. Aaliyah Brooks remained by his side, poised, her gaze steady and unflinching, observing not only the room but the interactions, the subtle gestures, and the undercurrents that went unnoticed by everyone else, and Daniel found himself studying her, appreciating the precision of her awareness, the way she had anticipated risk, and how she moved through the space with a calm authority that contrasted with the ostentatious control exhibited by the guests, understanding finally that influence did not come from wealth alone but from clarity, observation, and timely intervention. The city lights stretched endlessly below, reflecting off the glass facades of buildings and casting patterns across the rooftop, yet Daniel's attention remained anchored in the immediate reality, in the subtle shifts of behavior, in the quiet decisions that had prevented catastrophe, and he realized that the true measure of leadership, the kind that could prevent error and protect others, was not only in commanding attention but in knowing when to follow insight offered by those overlooked, underestimated, or disregarded. He shifted his weight, the polished floor beneath him making a soft echo, and considered how easily the night could have spiraled, how each small unnoticed gesture or hesitation could have altered outcomes, and in this moment, he acknowledged the profound impact of Aaliyah's presence, her foresight, and her courage, recognizing that her actions had not only preserved safety but had subtly recalibrated the room's energy, the interactions, and the perception of control, and that realization filled him with a mixture of respect, humility, and quiet awe. She glanced at him briefly, just enough for acknowledgement, and he returned the look, understanding that their silent communication carried more weight than words could convey, that her calm decisiveness had guided him as much as it had guided the situation, and that this lesson in attention and integrity would extend far beyond the confines of this evening. The soft music continued to filter through the glass, distant and inconsequential compared to the heightened awareness between them, and Daniel could feel a shift within himself, a recognition that true power required more than wealth, more than status, more than control over a room, but required the ability to perceive, the wisdom to respond, and the humility to learn from someone who had acted with quiet certainty in a moment where others had not. He exhaled slowly, deliberately, allowing the weight of comprehension to settle, and for the first time that night, he saw not only the city sprawling, not entirely, because the awareness of what had almost transpired lingered like a shadow behind his thoughts, and he understood now that control and influence were not simply measures of wealth or status, but of perception, timing, and the ability to recognize and act on information before it became urgent. Aaliyah Brooks remained beside him, composed, her posture relaxed yet intentional, eyes scanning the city below and the room behind them, moving with a quiet grace that carried authority. Without demand, and Daniel observed her, recognizing the rare combination of foresight, ethics, and calm decisiveness that had guided her actions, shaping the course of the evening in ways he had not anticipated, and in that recognition he felt a mixture of respect, curiosity, and a subtle humility that he had not experienced in years of boardroom negotiations and high-stakes decision-making. The city lights shimmered below, casting long reflections across the glass panels, and the soft murmur of voices from the lounge drifted upward, now seemingly inconsequential compared to the gravity of the moment between them, because the true impact of the evening was not in the accolades or appearances, but in the quiet choices and perceptive interventions that had prevented miscalculation, and Daniel reflected on how easily the scenario could have escalated if not for her timely awareness, noting how a single action, measured, deliberate, and ethically grounded, had redirected the trajectory of events, preserved safety, and recalibrated the perception of authority in the room, and he realized that this form of influence, unseen by most, was as powerful as any public assertion of dominance. He shifted slightly, the wind brushing past them, carrying the faint scent of evening air mingled with polished wood and glass, and he allowed himself to acknowledge the clarity she had provided, the subtle guidance, and the moral presence that had transformed what could have been a moment of chaos into a lesson in attention, responsibility, and judgment. He studied her again, noting the calm in her eyes, the precision in her movements, the quiet confidence that had anticipated each ripple of the evening and acted accordingly, and he recognized that respect was earned not through status or wealth, but through insight, ethical discernment, and the courage to act at the precise moment required, and in that realization, he felt a rare sense of grounding, a reminder that leadership extended beyond command, that human intelligence and moral clarity could quietly, yet profoundly, shape outcomes, and that those qualities, when exercised with intention and awareness, left an indelible mark on both events and perception. Daniel exhaled, slow and measured, feeling a connection not of familiarity but of understanding, an acknowledgement that the evening had been redirected by competence and foresight rather than dominance, and he allowed himself to integrate this lesson, internalizing the power of observation, the importance of ethical action, and the unexpected influence of those who act without expectation of recognition. And as he did, he looked at Aaliyah Brooks one last time, appreciating the subtle mastery of her presence, the enduring impact of her intervention, and the profound truth that sometimes the most significant change in any room comes from those who are seen only when they choose to be, and when they act with unwavering clarity, precision, and integrity.